Right, hello everyone. I think we'll make a start. So I'm Andrew Heron, working in the GESR team on these events. Thank you all very much for coming this morning. We've got a good lineup for today, so I hope some of you will pop back in for some of the other talks we've got on. So apart from this one, we've got something on energy policy and something on using the payment by results mechanism in MOJ, which are both quite interesting topics. I get the enviable job of doing the rather dull housekeeping announcements, so visitors have to be escorted. Please keep your passes on at all times, and there are no fire alarms planned, but if there is one, leave the building the way you came in. So without further ado, I just Markets Authority and also Nick Seaford. And one more thing, we're live streaming this event in case.
Okay, so I'm Mike Walker, my colleague Nick Seaford, who's going to be presenting some of the slides today. And I'm going to be talking about our competition impact assessment guidelines and why we think they're of use to people like you. So I'm going to, the outline is I'm going to have a brief introduction to what CMA does, Competition and Markets Authority. Then I'm going to talk about our role in advising and challenging government, and that provides a context for then talking to you about the competition impact assessment guidelines, how they work, how they should be used, how we can help you in your use of them. And then we're going to finish off with three case studies, one on taxi licensing, particularly on the recent Transport for London consultation on how you might regulate taxis and private hire vehicles in London. A case study on higher education, Nick's going to deal with that. And then finally something on alcohol and specifically concerns over alcohol abuse in city centres and the sale of high-strength alcohol. So, what is CMA? What's our job? So we are the UK's Competition Authority. We are the successor to what used to be two competition authorities in the UK, the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. They were banged together starting in April of 2014. So we're their successor. What's our job? Our duty is to promote competition both within and outside the UK for the benefit of consumers. 2 points to note on that duty. The most important one, by a distance, is our job is about doing stuff for the benefit of consumers. As an organisation, that's all we care about. We don't care about businesses, except to the extent that caring about businesses is good for consumers. And equally, we don't care about anything that doesn't lead either directly or indirectly to consumer benefit. So that's our focus. Second point, it is interesting that we have been given this duty to promote competition both within and outside the UK. Broadly speaking, we ignore that because I don't think we are the world's competition authority. It is just quite an interesting point to note. Okay, so our mission is to make markets work well in the interest of consumers, businesses and the UK economy. Just to reiterate what I said about consumers, that's what we care about. So when we worry about making markets work well in the interest of businesses, we only care about that to the extent that in doing that, that leads on to consumer benefit. So we're certainly not in the business of just looking after businesses per se. We're in the business of looking after the competitive process, which may often actually involve helping out businesses, but again, only because ultimately it leads to consumer benefit. Ambition, we want to be one of the leading competition and consumer agencies in the world. Fine. So that's our job. How do we do it, and where does what I'm going to talk about today fit into that? So there's two broad legal planks to what we do. So there's competition law enforcement. So that's on the left as you're looking at that, and there's consumer law enforcement. On the competition law enforcement side, we worry about things like anti-competitive agreements. So we worry about cartels, firms colluding together to raise prices. The UK is one of the very few countries in the world where engaging in a cartel is actually a criminal offence. Most of the world, engaging in a cartel can lead to your firm being fined. In the UK, it can lead to you going to jail. So we worry about anti-competitive agreements like that. We worry about abuse of dominance. So those are issues related to large firms abusing, in some sense, their market position. So, for instance, charging excessive prices or anti-competitively driving out other firms. A good example of this sort of investigation at the European level at the moment is the European Commission's investigation into Google. That is like an abuse of dominance investigation. That is a non-pejorative statement as to whether or not there has been abuse there. The Commission's still looking at it, but that's the type of case. And merger control. Again, another aspect of competition law that we care about. So, for instance, on Friday we cleared the merger between BT and EE, so the BT fixed telecoms company, amongst other things, EE mobile telephone company. So that's another aspect of our job is to look at large mergers to check they're not going to be anti-competitive, meaning they won't harm consumers. So we cleared that merger on Friday. So that's competition law enforcement. Okay, if we go to the other side, on the right-hand side, consumer law enforcement is things like unfair contract terms, unfair commercial practices. So, for instance, the Office of Fair Trading, one of our predecessor bodies, had a go perfectly reasonably at the airline industry over their pricing practices, in particular over drip pricing. The idea that you're going to book a flight to Madrid and you go online and it tells you it costs you £40 and then you click and that's great, and then you click through on that and you find you have to pay a bit more for baggage, so that's suddenly £50, and then you have to pay a bit more for oxygen on board and that's £60. And the Officer of Trading stop the airline being able to engage in that overt drip pricing, and there's pieces of consumer legislation that we have to enforce. So unfair contract terms, for instance, might be contracts which, after the event, consumers find they're not able to get out of, even when they have reasonable grounds for doing so, because they didn't read all 17,000 words of the small print, for instance. Halifax Bank, I think, is 27,000 words in their terms and conditions that you will click on when you do anything with Halifax Bank. Okay, so that's consumer law enforcement. In the middle of that, we've got something called market studies and investigations. So market studies are where we get to look at a whole industry. This is actually a UK-specific piece of legislation, a market investigation, where we get to look at a whole industry and just think about how we can make it work better. Apart from us, Mexico has this type of legislation. I think Israel does, and that's it. So it's got a very UK-centric piece of legislation. But you'll be aware at the moment that CMA is looking at the energy market. That's a market investigation. We've been asked by Ofgem, the regulator, to look at the energy market to decide if it is working well for consumers, if there are ways in which it can be made to work better. We've got some provisional findings on that. We're reporting later this year. Banking, another market investigation, same sorts of issues. That's market investigations. Market studies, they're a little bit... They're not unique. They're just where we look at an industry and make some recommendations to government, to the industry, and that's a number of authorities have that power. Okay. Below that, so I'm now going to get to the sort of bit that we're really focusing on today. Below that, we have some softer enforcement tools, which includes compliance work. So we spend quite a lot of time making sure that business understands their responsibilities under competition law and under consumer law. Just guidance, again, to business, and advocacy. Advocacy is the space that we're in today. This is our role talking to government, both central and local government, about competition or consumer issues that arise in the work of government. Obviously, government spends a lot of time doing stuff that has effect on markets. one of our jobs is to worry about whether some of what government is doing is going to adversely affect the way in which markets work, and adversely affect the way in which markets work to the an extent that you might want to think again about the policy. So, and that's been a role for competition authorities to undertake sort of since forever. In recent years, actually, in the UK at least, we have an increasingly formal role. So under the Enterprise Act 2002, so that's 13, 14 years ago, CMA, although obviously then it was the OFT, can make proposals or give information and advice to government in relation to any of its functions. So that's just making proposals, very sort of soft interventions. Under the Small Business Enterprise Employment Act 2015, we have powers to make recommendations to ministers on the impact of proposals for legislation on competition within any UK markets for goods and services, with an explanatory note saying there is a presumption that our recommendations will be accepted unless there's strong policy reasons not to do so. Okay, and I'll come on to exactly what that might mean, but that is a slightly harder tool that we've now been given. And we have a ministerial steer from November of last year, where we are actively encouraged in the ministerial steer we've been given by central government to actively challenge central and local government to encourage effective competition, do so at the highest level as need be. But I think importantly, at least from our point of view, that government has undertaken to respond to any proposals, recommendations we make within 90 days, and the expectation is that if government is not going to take on board one of our recommendations, they have to explicitly tell us why not. Because obviously there might be lots of reasons for not, and we'll come on to that, but has to explicitly tell us why not. Okay. So, what is our aim in advocacy? And then how do the competition impact assessment guidelines fit into that? So, our aim is to ensure that the effects of policies at central or local level on competitive outcomes are taken into account. Our aim is not to stop all policies that adversely affect competition. There's a bundle of stuff that government does that adversely affects competition within a market, but which is entirely justified for other policy grounds. Okay? There are other policy aims beyond competition. There is quite often a trade-off between the effect of a policy on competition and other welfare-enhancing effects. Just to give you a generic example, any time we have a regulator that imposes a price cap in an industry, that has an adverse effect on competition. You impose a price cap on the industry, you're basically stopping the competitive process. But we often think that's fine. We think it's absolutely fine that things like, historically, energy and water and telecoms have been price regulated. Increasingly, they're not price regulated as technology moves on. But yeah, just as an example of when policy that adversely affects competition might be entirely reasonable. So we're not in the job of saying any policy that hurts competition is bad. We are, however, in the job of saying any policy that adversely affects competition, at least when you are recommending that policy, you're doing it with your eyes open. Yeah. Here's a policy, yes, I know it adversely affects competition, but I've thought about that, and I've decided on the basis of evidence that the positive benefits of the policy outweigh the harm to competition. And that's a perfectly reasonable trade-off for government to make. Much better, however, to do it with our eyes open. And generally, from our point of view, our experience is that the earlier people think about the potential competition effects of policies, the easier it is to sculpt policy to minimise those adverse impacts. So, what does that actually mean? Well, okay, so we've got this ambition to be a trusted and challenging competition advisor to government. I think the important point there is the trusted bit. We would like government to feel they can come to CMA and talk to us about, we've got this policy aim we want to carry out. We can see how it might adversely affect competition. Can you help us evaluate that? Think about what alternative approaches to this problem we might engage in that will have less effect on competition. We don't really want, or we absolutely don't want to be in a world where we spend our time coming to try and bash central government or local government and say you haven't thought about competition aspects, because that's generally not very productive. What we'd much prefer is for people to come to us because they've looked at our competition impact assessment guidelines, which I will eventually get onto, and say, look, there's a competition issue here. How can you help us mitigate it? So we want to work to identify legislation, policies, and practices that are likely to affect markets, to challenge government when restrictions and competition are being created, and in particular, to make suggestions for alternative approaches. And then the big thing today is actually we would like to build competition expertise within government, because you guys are a bunch of economists. All we do is microeconomics. Absolutely what we do is not rocket science. It's just basic microeconomics, thinking about things like how does market structure affect market outcomes, how do policies affect incentives, all the stuff that economists, the bread and butter of being an economist. Okay. Within that context, we would much prefer, generally, on these three arrows, reactive advice, proactive advice, and capacity building, I think we'd much prefer to be at the top or the bottom. So we'd much prefer to be offering reactive advice, because the government has come to us and said, what are the competition issues here, how can we mitigate them? And we'd also like to be in the bottom arrow, which is about capacity building, which is about us being able to share our sort of thinking on how you analyse competition issues so that people can self-assess. And that's where the competition impact assessment guidelines fit in. Okay. We will also offer proactive advice where we think there's a potential competition issue that isn't being considered properly by either central or local government. And often we will do that because we're talking about a sector or a market that we've actually done work on in the recent past in a different context. We've done a market study, or we've done a load of merger work in that area, and we know that area. But generally, we prefer not to be in proactive advice. We prefer people to be coming to us. So, okay, I'm not entirely sure why I left this slide in, since it's not really relevant here. But just to look at the bottom bullet here, where possible, use market mechanisms to achieve your aims. A lot of our work in terms of giving helpful advice as to how policies can be designed so as to minimise their adverse impacts on competition are about thinking about the market mechanism and seeing how you can go with the grain of the market mechanism, and go with the incentives that market players have, rather than trying to do something that actually goes against those incentives, because we're economists, we understand incentives are really powerful, and if we spend our time trying to advise on policies that are contrary to people's incentives, they're probably not going to work very well. So, the competition impact assessment guidelines. So, the purpose of these is that they're short guidelines. These are a revision from the original 2007 guidelines that the FT issued. The purpose of these guidelines is to help policymakers to know when they need to think about competition impact of a policy, and if they need to think about those impacts, how they should think about those impacts. Okay. I did provide very practical advice on how to do that assessment in a two-stage assessment that I'm going to come on to. And these guidelines very much complement other policy guides, such as, work from the OECD in this area, Treasury's Green Book, or the Better Regulation Executive Guidance. Okay. So it's very, we hope, complementary to that sort of work. So, what do we mean by competition impact assessment? So, we have a policy, a proposed policy, and we want to think about whether it has any implications for competition. So, step one is to initial screening, as we put it in the guidelines, is to ask the question, does the measure affect a market where products or services are supplied by private or public sector organisations? So, does it affect a market, an economic market where therefore we might have detriment? If it doesn't, fine, stop, no problem. If it does, so this is a policy that is going to affect a recognisable economic market, then you need to think about competition effects, and that's a question of applying the competition checklist and on the basis of that checklist, asking the question, is there likely to be a restriction of competition as a result of this policy? If you decide, having applied that checklist, that there won't be a restriction of competition, that's fine. Stop the analysis. If you decide on the basis of the initial screening that there might be a restriction of competition, then undertake a more in-depth competition assessment. So what is this initial competition checklist? Okay, very simple to any economist. It's the sort of microeconomics 101. So what sort of things we need to think about? Well, first of all, think about whether the policy is going to directly or indirectly limit the number or range of suppliers. Yeah? It's not always the case that fewer players in a market means less competition. So we can think about, Bertram homogeneous products market. Actually, once you get more than two players, increasing player doesn't improve the competitive outcome. Some bidding markets, you might need relatively few players to get a competitive outcome. But as a general proposition for microeconomics, fewer players in a market, once you get down to small numbers, tends to lead to less good competitive outcomes for consumers. So ask yourself the question, is this a policy which is likely to limit the number or range of suppliers? Is it a policy that actually isn't going to limit the number of suppliers, but is going to limit their ability to compete? Okay? We know that merely having a bunch of firms in a market isn't enough to guarantee competition. We've got a bunch of firms in the market and they're all colluding. We're going to get the cartel outcome, which might well be the monopoly outcome. Okay? So you want to think about, is this a policy that is going to stop firms from competing, either because it stops them being able to compete, or it stops them having the incentive to compete. So you might think about a policy that's going to affect a market where there's very vigorous competition and suppliers don't know what each other are doing, so they're all a bit paranoid and so they are competing very hard. You might think about a policy that, for whatever reason, makes everything much more transparent in that market. Suddenly suppliers can see what each other are doing. We might expect that to have an adverse effect on competition, but we might expect that to make it easier for firms to collude, or at least to compete more softly. And then the final sort of initial checklist in the guidance is, does the policy limit choices and information available to consumers? So those first three boxes, 1, 2 and 3, are all about supply side. They're all about how does this affect the suppliers in the market, numbers, their ability to compete. This fourth one is about consumers. Okay, so does it limit consumers' choices or the information available to them? One of the things that has become increasingly clear to competition authorities, and certainly to UK competition authorities over the last 10 years or so, is that consumer information is a very important aspect of competition. If you want consumers to be able to make informed choices and therefore drive suppliers to respond to that, to consumers' wishes, you need consumers to be informed. Okay? And there's a lot of behavioural economics over the last 5-10 years or so, which is focusing on just how damaging uninformed consumers can be to good competitive outcomes. Okay, so that's the basic initial competition checklist. It's all very standard in terms of thinking about why those matter. So you've got a policy, you've gone through that checklist, and you have decided, for whatever reason, that actually, it looks like there might be a competition problem. It looks like this policy might have an adverse effect on the number of firms in the market or their ability to compete. So at that point, we suggest you undertake a more in-depth competition assessment. So this is the phase 2 of this guidance. And what should we be doing under this phase? Well, first of all, you need to identify what the affected markets are and establish a baseline, or in our normal terminology, work out what your counterfactual is. So if you are going to appraise a policy, to think about whether it will harm competition and whether it will harm competition in a way that is significant enough for that to outweigh the other positive aspects of the policy, then you need to establish a baseline in terms of, if we just go forward with the policy as it stands, what competitive outcomes is that going to lead to? So you can then compare that to the existing competitive outcome and equally compare that to a competitive outcome under alternative policy proposals that might have, broadly speaking, the same policy aim but affect competition differently. So you're going to start off by working out what your counterfactual is. You then have to assess the impact of the policy proposal on competition, so you can make those comparisons between the counterfactual and the existing situation, or the counterfactual and the alternative policy situation. So that's the assess impact policy proposal on competition, assess alternative proposals and potential implementation issues, compare the results, and then that will inform your decision making. Okay? And just to reiterate what I said earlier on, you may well at that point come to the conclusion, yes, this is a policy that harms competition, but it's a policy that has a clear policy aim that we want, and that is good for consumers, and that outweighs the adverse effects on competition, and this way of implementing the policy is the least anti-competitive way of doing it, and that's fine. That's a perfectly reasonable, coherent conclusion. But, as I said earlier, the point of these guidelines is to really make sure that we're doing that with our eyes open. Okay, I'm not going to go through the next 3 slides. They are very much there for you to take away, to have to hand, but they are just putting more detail on that initial simple checklist, that initial 4-point. This is just putting much more detail onto that. Okay, so as I say, I'm not going to go through those. Right, so how might this work in practice? So we're going to go into the sort of case studies. So the first case study I talked about is Transport for London's proposals on private hire vehicles. So, as many of you will know, Transport for London recently consulted on a range of new regulations on PHVs, private hire vehicles, minicabs. Okay, so these are minicabs, not taxis. Taxis are black cabs. We know how they operate. They can pick up off the street. Minicabs are these licensed vehicles, can't pick up off the street. Uber is a private hire vehicle organisation. It wouldn't be stretching things to suggest that TfL's proposals are primarily a response to Uber and a response to black cab concerns over the activity of Uber. So TfL have proposed a range of new regulations. They're only proposals at the moment. They include, for instance, so if you're a minicab, you're not a black cab, requiring a minimum 5-minute waiting time between booking and getting into a car. Okay? So you can't go onto on the proposal your Uber app, see that there's an Uber cab 30 seconds down the road and book it. Well, you can, but they've then got to wait 4.5 minutes before they can come pick you up. Under the proposals, TfL must approve all future changes to the business models of these of minicab firms. They must provide a facility to book up to 7 days in advance. So, for instance, Uber would currently fail that. They must provide a telephone landline that passengers can call at all times. So that means there must be, there's got to be a phone somewhere manned by somebody. These organisations. PHV operators cannot show vehicles being immediately available for hire via an app or physically in the street. That does sound a bit Uber-like, Fixed fares must be provided in advance of booking. Again, Uber's business model is it has its dynamic pricing. Drivers must only work for one private hire operator at a time. TfL wants to control ride sharing, where 2 different sets of passengers can share the same cab because they're getting the same place. Restricting use of advertising inside and outside the car. So let's very quickly think about how that set of proposals might line up against our competition impact assessment guideline, and then I'm going to hand over to Nick to talk about higher education. So the first checklist question would, do these proposals directly or indirectly limit the number or range of suppliers? Well, yes, you might argue. Mandating a pre-booking service, you must be able to book 7 days in advance. Mandating a fixed telephone landline that somebody has to be in the end of, you would expect those to raise costs. If you raise costs, you'd expect that to have a damaging effect on at least some business models and potentially reduce number of suppliers. Forbidding drivers from working for more than one operator, again, we'd expect that's likely to raise a fixed cost for an operator because they actually have to effectively guarantee, in order to get a driver, guarantee a driver enough work for them to live on. Again, that might create entry barriers. Again, very unlike Uber, which you can work for Uber and X number of other firms if you want. You can work for full time, or you can just work 3 or 4 hours a week. Okay, the second test limits the ability of suppliers to compete. Well, this 5-minute hire vehicles to compete with black cabs, who can pick up off the street. An aspect of the app is it allows very swift pickup times. Okay. Which is obviously a dimension of quality. If we go down to the bottom bullet there, requiring advanced specification of fares, TfL approval for the change in business models, preventing drivers from working for multiple operations. All of these are restrictions on potential business models and potential business model innovation. Because like Uber, it is clearly innovation, whatever you think about it. Again, that potentially harmful to consumers. It might be that actually consumers like what these private hire vehicle new business models are providing, and so these sort of proposals are damaging to consumers. Third one, limits and suppliers' incentive to compete vigorously. Well, this 5-minute waiting time issue, that weakens incentives for minicabs to innovate in terms of convenience and availability. You could easily imagine that 5-minute might become a focal point for that aspect of quality, and we don't move down to greater availability. Finally, limits of choices and information available to consumers. Well, as the proposals affect that in many ways. For instance, restrictions on ride sharing. Consumers might be very happy to have the opportunity of ride sharing. Typically, ride sharing increases your journey time, but it reduces the cost. And of course, black cabs used to run a ride sharing scheme out of Paddington, and that was popular. If you turn up to Paddington, you always see a great long queue, and then those who were going for ride sharing would be able to skip the queue. They had a longer journey time because there might be 4 people in the cab going to slightly different places, but consumers have that choice. So this sort of proposed regulation removes that choice. Restrictions on displaying vehicle availability, that's clearly a direct impact on consumer information. You can't sit in the pub saying, I want to lift home, and go on the app and see where your nearest Uber cab or blah blah car or whatever. Minimum 5 minutes waiting time, again, restricting choice on immediate pickup. So here's a bunch of proposals that if you look at and you go through the checklist, they look like they might have an adverse effect on competition. So we hope that TfL will be looking at their proposals and thinking about them in that light. So what's happened next? So we actually, CMA, have put in a consultation response to TfL on that. We've got a quote from that. A number of TfL's proposals will harm competition and by extension consumers. So if TfL wants to go ahead with those proposals, we think they need to provide some pretty good ground for why they benefit consumers in some other dimensions. Our Chief Executive, Alex Chisholm, had an article in the FT that's published in December. Quote from that: we all need to be bold enough to challenge, if necessary, the arguments of incumbents who stand to lose from disruptive change, so referring in that case to black cabs, who do lose out to this sort of disruptive change, but we shouldn't be in the world of trying to look after a particular business or a particular sector within a business. We should be worrying about consumers. Consumers who often benefit from technological disruption can struggle to make their voices heard. We all know regulators get captured by the people they're regulating. Consumer voice is often not heard, but watch what consumers do, and their actions speak loud and clear. Some consumers quite clearly like the Uber-type business model to use. We should be very careful about driving that out. So the consultation is closed, and we wait to see what TfL is going to do next. Nick.
So the second case study we're going to look at is Biz Green paper on higher education, which was published in November. So this is just an outline of the proposals in the Green Paper, and they can be taken in pairs. I'm not actually going to talk about the first two today, so if we just look by looking at the third one, this is a proposal to create a Teaching Excellence Framework, or a TEF, and this will be an award that will signal to students the quality of the university as judged. So the proposal is to have 3 or 4 levels of the TEF. So the universities that have a level 4 TEF award are signalling that they are the highest quality type of university. The 4th proposal listed here is connected, which is that some alternative providers that currently face a cap on their student numbers will be allowed to increase their student numbers if they get a higher TEF award, so they'll see that cap increase. And interestingly, also traditional providers who get a higher TEF award will be able to increase their fees more than traditional providers who get a lower TEF award. The 5th proposal is to require providers to have a student protection scheme in place for if that provider closes. So if my university shuts down, my university has an arrangement with another HE provider, so I can continue my course elsewhere, and there'll also be a requirement on them to give me some financial recompense for that. And then finally, in certain circumstances, the government, rather than triggering that student protection requirement, will save the failing provider. So just to go through how some of these, sort of plugging them through the competition checklist, I think it's worth starting by saying CMA is being quite positive about the Green Paper as a whole and about some of the specific proposals. So if we start, I'm going to go in the wrong order in terms of the checklist, but if we start with what's the effect on information and choices available to students. So the Teaching Excellence Framework is going to be an award that signals the quality of the HE provider. This will help students choose which providers they want to apply to, and this in turn may incentivise providers to respond to that student demand. So if it works well, if the TEF works well, it's a really nice example of better information on quality feeding through to student demand, which in turn incentivises the provider to increase the quality. So again, some more proposals that actually the CMA have been quite positive about. So if you take the top half of the slide, checklist question 1, what's the impact of some of the proposals on the number of suppliers? So in the old world, before the proposals, if you're a new provider and you want to offer degree courses and you don't have degree awarding powers, you have to get an incumbent university to validate your degrees and say, yeah, they're fine, you can go and offer those and call them degrees. I think you can see why that might cause a barrier to entry if Nick Seaford Higher Education Providers Limited goes to the University of Nottingham and says, I want to offer a course very similar to one you're offering. The University of Nottingham might think, well, we don't want this new competitor, so we're not going to validate their courses. Or the reasons for not validating might be less, there might be less malintent, the provider might not, the traditional university just might not be interested in validating new degrees. So one of the positive effects of the traditional validation model is that the validating university has an incentive to maintain a certain quality standard in the degrees they validate, to protect the reputation of their own degrees. One of the proposals that BIS have made to address this possible barrier to entry caused by the validation model is to allow other organisations who don't offer their own degrees to validate the degrees of new providers. So, for instance, professional associations, trade associations who want to validate courses will be able to do so. So this potentially might increase the number of suppliers who are able to enter the market, so then there'll be more HE providers and potentially more competition and better competitive outcomes for students. On to the second half of the slide. As I mentioned, currently some alternative providers face student number controls. So if I am wanting to offer degree courses, and I can only take 100 students because of the government set student number cap, I'm probably not going to be much of a competitive pressure on University of Manchester with 38,000 students. What BIS are proposing is that those providers with a high TEF award will be able to increase their student numbers. So there will be more spaces on offer, there will be more competition, and it will allow different types of provider to compete on a more equal basis and force them to compete a little bit more strongly for student demand. Also, this has a positive effect on the incentive to reach a higher quality, because you can only increase your student numbers if you reach this higher TEF award. So as I said, we're quite positive about the green proposal overall. So those are all proposals that, if you feed them through the competition checklist, it seems you get quite positive outcomes. I thought I would pick one area where we're maybe a little bit more concerned about what the impact might be. So as I mentioned, one of the proposals is that, as well as a student protection requirement in case a provider has to shut, in some circumstances the government will save failing universities. And a couple of the circumstances that are mentioned are to maintain a broad spectrum of provision for students and to ensure local provision. In both of these circumstances, we have some concerns about how this might play out. So if there is a novel provider that's providing something slightly different, and it's increasing the spectrum of provision, and it's high quality and students want it, there should be enough demand there to allow that provider to continue. If there isn't enough demand there and the provider looks like it's failing, that's perhaps quite a good signal that that's not actually a particularly valid course, a particularly high quality course. It's not clear that the government should then come in and save that provider. In terms of ensuring local provision, while sometimes you might think that will be valid, I think we think that it's probably a national market a lot of the time for higher education. So the University of Exeter is probably to some extent in competition with the University of Durham, even though they're on opposite sides of the country. It's not clear, certainly at that end of the market, that you need a competitor to the University of Durham in every single location in the country. And I think more broadly, we're concerned about what this could do to incentives on providers. So if I am running Nick Seaford Higher Education Providers Limited, I'm not doing very well, I'm beginning to lose demand, I'm not quite getting enough students, I might have two options. One is to improve the quality of what I'm offering to get more students, and the other might be to get the government bailout. And if I have certain characteristics, or I'm in a certain area and I know it's quite likely that I'll get bailed out by the government, that undermines my incentive to produce what students want, to raise my quality in order to stay open. So as I said, we're quite positive about the Green Paper as a whole. Quite a lot of the proposals in the Green Paper line up very well with what we've recommended in the past. So in March 2015, we published a report recommending certain changes to the way higher education is regulated. Quite a lot of this is very similar to what's now been in the Green Paper, which clearly we welcomed. However, of course, there were some areas where we have some concerns, and we've just responded to the Green Paper with some of our concerns and our more positive comments as well. And we're looking forward to seeing what BIS have to say. I'm going to hand back to Mike for the third case study and the conclusion.
Okay, so the third case study is alcohol. So the issue here is, in particular, high strength alcohol. So we're talking sort of white ciders, high strength lagers, potentially a problem at the national level. Alcohol misuse leads to lots of health issues. It's been allied to lots of violent crime, domestic abuse issues, and then at local level, antisocial behaviour, street drinkers, so-called, in the streets, local policing costs, local A&E costs, yeah, all standard costs of alcohol abuse. So that's the issue. Now, what's the proposed solution? So the Scottish and the Welsh governments are both pursuing minimum unit pricing. So that would be legislation saying you cannot sell alcohol at a price below a certain price per unit of alcohol. So if you're selling a bottle of white cider and it's got 10 units in it and the minimum unit price for alcohol is, let's say, 50p, then you can't sell that bottle for less than £5. That would be the idea. So both the Scottish and Welsh governments are pursuing minimum unit pricing. There's also been a range of local schemes that local authorities have put forward where local authorities have done things such as encourage retailers to destock certain high-strength lagers and ciders in order to stop street drinkers being able to access them. Encourage retailers to not sell below certain prices. So that's a bit similar to the minimum unit pricing, but this is done at a local level in English local authorities. Or to introduce optional or mandatory licensing criteria, i.e. you cannot sell beer or lager which is above a certain alcohol percentage. So, a little bit interactivity here. How do we think those are policy prescriptions fit under the competition checklist? So, sort of a policy that encourages retailers to destock certain high-strength lagers and ciders. Is that a problem under any of those 4 criteria that we've got? Where you tell me the answer. Okay, so that's something where we'd expect it to reduce choice. Okay, so that's limiting the choices available to consumers. Okay. What about the next one? Encouraging retailers to not sell alcohol below certain prices.
Limits the ability to compete.
Fine. So it limits the ability to compete in terms of retailers competing on the price of those particular products. Okay. Any other effect on competition? Might it have an effect on competition for other alcohol products that are not such high strength?
So an implicit price for the potential for the products not affected, a floor price or.
Okay, so I think we can see absolutely that we're likely to have this proposal reduces competition between sellers of high strength cider and lager. But at some level, we would have expected that high-strength cider and lager are substitutes, possibly weak substitutes, but substitutes for non-high-strength cider and non-high-strength lager. So if we've increased the price of a substitute, what do as a normal supplier? You probably increase your prices. Okay, so we'd expect this policy, right, want to do some evidence-based analysis, not just to have the effect of increasing the price of high-strength alcohols. We'd expect it to have a knock-on effect on other alcohol. Okay, what about the introducing optional or mandatory licensing criteria, i.e. that you can't sell particular beer, lager, not larger, beer, lager or cider that is above a certain alcohol percentage? How does that fit under the checklist? Okay, yeah. Why?
Can't diversify their products or innovate their products.
Okay, so it has an effect on suppliers' incentive to compete. Okay, and what about on consumer choices? Okay, so it directly affects the ability for consumers to choose high-strength cider and beer. Now, so we can see that this sort of proposal, under the competition checklist, fails in a number of places. That doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, it's a bad policy. It just means you need to think about what your policy aims are and whether these adverse effects on competition outweigh your policy aims, or whether there's another way of getting your aims. For instance, that bottom one, whereby you're not selling beer or lager above a certain percentage, that directly restricts consumer choice. But yeah, that's sort of the point of the policy. So actually that might be fine. but at least think about the effect this is having on competition. Okay, so you can see that it's a fairly intuitive, simple sort of checklist to go through. Where are we with alcohol? Well, Scottish legislation on minimum alcohol pricing was passed in 2012. It then got appealed by the Scottish Whisky Association. The European Court of Justice, in a judgment late last year, have said, in principle, such a scheme might be okay, but Scottish Government, you need to show that this scheme is the best way, the most proportionate way to achieve your policy aims. And that, we're entirely with the court on that. That is a very sensible way to think about this sort of policy. And the Scottish Government may come back and provide a bunch of evidence and say, yes, this is the best way for us to achieve our policy aims, in which case, fine. But they are going to have to go through that hoop. Welsh Government is currently consulting. We're waiting to hear what they're going to decide. And we have published, end of last year, some guidance to help retailers and local authorities avoid competition law breaches. It's actually a little bit stronger than what I was talking about. You could imagine a world in which local authority says to retailers, and there's some evidence that some authorities have done this, said to retailers, you've got to talk to your competitor retailers to agree what you're not going to stock and agree what prices you're going to sell stuff up. You've got to raise prices. That's just cartelisation. That's just breaking the law. Generally not a good idea for government, central or local, to encourage people to break the law. Okay, so just to reiterate, we absolutely recognise there are other policy goals beyond competition, but we do want, our objective is to ensure that competition is considered in a coherent policy trade-off. So, got our guidelines, so you can do some self-assessment. Equally, as I said earlier, we're very, very happy to react to questions you put to us or policy issues. And so there's a bunch of contact email, John Kirkpatrick, who runs the advocacy team, and then Kate and Elliot and Nick, who are part of the advocacy team. So we have 5 minutes for any questions, if there are any.
Hi, I just have a question on going back to your kind of black cabs and Transport for London. In a case where black cabs are really heavily regulated already, how does that kind of go into competition with Uber, who are kind of unregulated? So kind of stopping regulation on Uber or recommending, but also against another kind of market where black cabs are very heavily regulated in terms of pricing and other things like that. Just be interested in that.
Okay, so that's a fair question. I mean, the answer is, as with all of this stuff, is where you've got a sector which is heavily regulated, is you need to think about, so why is it heavily regulated? Okay, so if we think about taxis worldwide are price regulated. It's not a London thing, it's not a UK thing. Worldwide, taxis are price regulated. Why is that? Because there's this idea that once you're in the taxi, you're a captive consumer, you need to know that those prices are set at a regulated level so that you're not going to be ex-ante price gouged. Okay, so and that's how the black cab. That's why they're regulated, perfectly reasonable. So, given they're price regulated, what does that imply for the regulation of the prices of minicabs? Well, okay, in a black cab, the issue is you get in. It depends. There's a schedule of prices. It depends how far you go, what time of day. You get the price. In a minicab, you get in. You're quoted the price before you start. Yep. Okay, and there's a bunch of rules. Minicabs, including Uber, who have to publicise what their schedule is. So you are allowed to have dynamic pricing within that. Again, you've got to publicise what those are, and then consumers can make their own choice. Okay, so. There, it's not that the regulation of black cab pricing is unfair compared to Uber. If you think about what is the purpose of it, okay? Now, at some point in the future, you could imagine a world in which black cabs move away from that sort of pricing, move away from regulated pricing, if they were to move to a different model, which is, for instance, you set the fee at the start of the journey. That's perfectly plausible. If you're not going to do that, then it's reasonable for them to be price regulated. As always, I'm broken record here. We're not against regulation per se. We are, however, against regulation where nobody's thought about what the potential adverse impacts of it are and trade those off against the positive impacts. Got questions over here?
At the front.
Okay. Thanks for all that. It was really interesting. It's a follow-up, really. So with the higher education proposals and the BIS proposals, I mean, it occurred to me that you were allowing BIS to bundle their policies. So if you had a teaching excellence framework in its own right, cold, then that's it's a barrier to entry. It's it's encouraging collusion and so on. But because you allow the BIS to bundle it with releasing extra student places, then the overall net picture might be positive. So are you restricted by the policy proposals put forward by the government department, or can you say, hang on a sec, you're combining conveniently, loosely related policies here for a positive net picture?
What do you think the problem with the teaching excellence framework is?
So it depends on the counterfactual, because there is one already, isn't there, basically? But if there wasn't, then you're saying you're applying a common framework of standards around otherwise freely competing providers, which means maybe you reduce consumer choice by taking out low quality. You set a benchmark level that everyone has to meet, and so on. So if it was in its own right, it would be hard to argue it's a good thing, because bits have tied it to saying, well, we'll give the good extra places to the good ones. Why not give the extra places to wherever the extra places want to go to? It depends on your counterfactual.
So this is stuff that we've sort of thought quite a lot about. The potential for something like a teaching excellence framework to impose a certain framework around competition. And in our response, we have highlighted certain risks that the teaching excellence framework should be flexible enough to appeal to a diverse range of student preferences, and should use metrics and measures where it's possible for a new provider to provide evidence to get them up to a higher level, as well as a sort of traditional incumbent provider. I think in the market for higher education, one thing we have to perhaps recognise, or be aware of, is the fact that it's not... students might not always, especially prospective students who haven't gone to university yet, might not always be in the best place to judge what is high quality provision. And this is because it being what's often termed an experience good, you can't always judge how good that provision is going to be. So there is some role for government to set out some framework for quality, for what is quality provision. That's not to say that student choice shouldn't drive production decisions in the market, which we do think. But in terms of defining quality, students have a role, but there is perhaps also a role for the sector and government. But it's kind of a bit philosophical in a way. But I certainly accept the risks that you're highlighting. I mean, yeah.
You would have enjoyed the discussion we had internally in CMA, where there's a couple of academics, and we were both very jaundiced about the idea that students had any idea what was actually good for them, and then a bunch of people who were saying it's all about consumer choice and competition. So these things aren't clear.
I wanted to talk about the higher education example as well. So you've shown how it passes your checklist test and it improves competition. But I think a lot of people say that competitive markets in higher education is detrimental to the whole system of education. So I just was wondering, does that mean the CMA takes it as given that competition is desirable in a sector, and therefore just makes no comment on whether it's actually worth having increased competition? Because I know you say that you're part of a comprehensive policy trade-off, but this situation, it's not restrictions on the quality of competition. The debate is more about whether there should be competition in the first place.
So the first thing I would say is usually what happens is the government will decide whether they want a market or not in a public service or any area of national life. And then our role is, government have said we want a market, our role is often to think, given that government wants a market, what's the best way of delivering it in a competitive manner, in a way that maximises the quality of outcomes? You might think that's a bit of a cop-out answer. In terms of the sort of specific proposals, I think we have recognised that we would defend the use of competition in higher education, but we have recognised that certain protections need to be in place given the nature of the market. So we have recognised that government has a role in setting quality standards. We have called for a minimum baseline regulation that you can't compete beneath. We have said that there should be some student protection requirement, which, all these things are interventions in the market that we have often explicitly called for. So I don't think we're sort of calling for totally free competition, but we're saying that above a certain baseline, competition can drive better outcomes if students are well informed.
And just to widen that, I mean, generally our starting point is competition is good, more competition is better than less competition. But we absolutely recognise that's not always true. And if you think about drip pricing, drip priced by airlines, very competitive market, but they got into an unhealthy equilibrium because once one set of firms starts drip pricing, you all have to drip price because otherwise your headline rates look very anti-competitive. So any markets where there's significant asymmetric information between supplier and consumer, or where there's consumer biases that can be exploited, when you get into those sorts of markets, it stops being so clear that more competition is always good because you can get into unhealthy equilibria. So we certainly recognise that you can't always assume that more competition is good. Not true across all markets. Okay, I think we're wrapping up. Although I think we're happy to hang around for another 5 minutes if everybody else has disappeared.
Thank you very much, Michael. Right, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming to our second seminar on the seminar day. We're very pleased to have Michael Grubb, who's Professor of International Energy and Climate Change at UCL, and also a Senior Advisor at Ofgem, here to talk to us today. He is apparently the author of 8 books, 50 journal articles, and numerous other publications, and his book, Planetary Economics, was published in 2014 and forms the sort of background to his talk today. I hope that's right. And I'm sure it's available in all good bookshops if you want to go purchase it. And it is actually on Amazon, I just checked that. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Michael.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the invitation to speak. And I should probably just start, not so much with an advert, I hope, but at least a clarification. Because first, two things. First, I saw that they've been advertised with an Ofgem hat. I have a half and half life between academia and Ofgem senior advisor. Worth saying that the post in Ofgem came up partly because of a sense of tension between the direction of government policy and the regulator being perceived as getting in the way. And Ofgem was given duties to protect the interest of present and future consumers, leaving Ofgem with a little bit of a headache as to what on earth does it actually mean to protect future consumers. And so I was brought in partly in that capacity. I told my colleagues at Ofgem, obviously, as doing this, and they're perfectly comfortable, but it should not be attributed to Ofgem, anything that I say, because it's really drawing much more on the academic side of my life, where I'd like to give thanks also to co-authors on this book, Carsten Neuhoff at DIW in Berlin and Jean-Charles Ricard at CERN in Paris, respectively, in effect, micro and macro economists, with all of us having a common interest around the application of economics and political economy in both energy and environment and the interface thereof. So what I thought would be useful, or hopefully of interest today, would be to try and set out some of the broader themes that emerged from this fairly major endeavour into this book. Set it in the context of, if you like, where the broad international debate on energy is at. Go into some of the structural thinking in the book. I want to say a little bit about why are some of the kind of economic issues we focus on particularly important in energy, or appear to be, touch on generic implications, and then sort of end up, potentially end up by saying what on earth has Seneca got to do with it anyway, him being a sort of a Greek scholar several hundred years BC. If we have time and interest at the end, I'm very happy to go on to just a couple of slides about current energy options in the UK and what I see as outstanding energy policy debates in the UK. But I know it's a diverse audience here, not energy specialists, so I think I'll be driven by you whether or not you want me to go into those areas after, so being filled up with the rest. First of all, in energy, it's become commonplace to talk about the trilemma. In many big energy conferences, it's just a word that just trips off the tongue. The World Energy Congress, which is the main industry body, has sort of more or less embodied the concept of the trilemma as just the fundamental need to express the idea that energy policy has to get to grips with three basic issues. One is price and competitiveness of energy supply, then the security of energy supply, and the environment and sustainability dimensions of energy supply. And there's a sort of natural tendency to say, okay, so clearly here there's got to be a balance, a trade-off, which are the real priorities, because you can't do everything at once, which is actually something that the industry and many of the rest of us tend to push back on. Partly because on the right-hand side, when you look at the trends in political discussion, which matters most can vary according to political circumstances and actual developments, which is not very helpful in an industry where typically you're looking at capital investments that may take many years to get in place and have a lifetime of half a century. What we have obviously seen and remains true is price and competition goals became the dominant issue over the previous 3-4 years because we're at an all-time high in energy prices. Environmental goals have been broadly driven by climate change, which took a bit of a back burner. It slightly ebbs and flows. Environmental concerns have a history of having their own sort of commodity cycle. But has to some extent been pushed further back onto the agenda by the combination of the Paris conference, I imagine most of you heard about, the floods, and actually quite an entrenched institutional system and conviction in the UK system that this is a problem which has to be dealt with on a systemic basis. And then rising concern about security of supply. In Europe, driven more by high import dependence. The UK somewhat less so, but as you see from headline, every autumn basically is the annual season for scares about the lights going out and has been for the last 5 years. And that's something I can come back to at the end. The fundamental point is, of course, both security and the environment are public goods. They are not going to be delivered just by saying, let's have a competitive market and let's get out of the way of it. But they're quite hard to marketise so that you get the right signals. And it's that tension, dilemma, and the underpinning thoughts that I want to bring forward as we speak, but wrapped into a look at underlying economics of energy. Before I do that, let me just say, I think 2 slides about particularly the nature of this climate change beast. I mean, security in some senses is easier by comparison because everyone accepts that society, a first job of government is to maintain the security of its citizens, and when we're so dependent on energy, the assumption is government has an absolute duty to take care of the security of energy supplies, and hence the headlines, hence the concerns. And it tends to has its own stronger feedback as people get more worried by events. Climate change is a bit different because it is such a big, long, global, slow burn issue, and it's also still wrapped in a lot of uncertainties. It's fundamentally a problem of risk management and deep risk management. You talk to the climate scientists, and it's not uncertainty about the underlying primary science. I mean, that is very easy. You put 40 billion tonnes a year of a heat-trapping gas in the atmosphere, the surface will warm. A warming surface will drive a stronger hydrological cycle, more extreme events, some sea level rise. None of that is scientifically controversial. But actually trying to say, well, yeah, but actually when and where and how bad will the impacts be, and what can you, and how costly would it be to offset those, and who should act, and how do you coordinate responses, and how do you value those kinds of intrinsically uncertain impacts, hard to monetize, many of them falling on other people, more future generations. That's where there's huge amounts of uncertainty come in. It's a field that's attracted some interesting epitaphs or comments over the years. Nick Stern called it, in fact, the former chief economist here at the Treasury, former chief economist at the World Bank, called it the biggest market failure in history in a report that was very huge coverage about 10 years back. Moral philosophers have got in on the act and called it the perfect moral storm, because it's fundamentally about how much do we citizens today care about impact on lots of other people, other countries, other generations, other species, risks, who should bear, etc. And social scientists increasingly just call it a super wicked problem, because it is so infernally difficult to solve institutionally and politically. You could say testifying to that is we have not been doing very well globally. It's 25 years since the problem was officially first acknowledged by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we launched global negotiations. And even over the last decade, global emissions have been rising about over 2% a year, until 2015, incidentally, when for the first time ever we saw effectively stabilisation of global emissions alongside 3 or 4% economic growth. As alluded, though, in the UK we've seen energy debate dominated by bills with growing concerns about security, and partly a linking, or at least an attempt to link some of the security concerns with some of the decarbonisation, renewables, intermittency concerns. And if what you want to do is to say, well, this should be easy, we just need to put a carbon price into the economic system so the market will respond appropriately, you have to deal with a bundle of other problems, the cascade of uncertainties, which mean that actually 25 years on we have not remotely resolved the debate about what is the social cost of carbon. About 15 years ago, I thought one of the more intelligent commentators said, well, we know the answer, and it's somewhere between 10 and £1,000 per, or dollars per tonne of CO2. It's kind of a rather large range, and we may have narrowed it somewhat, but not huge, which creates problems, given, obviously, shorter-term economics concerns, industrial opposition, and the fact that it's very intangible. So the psychological community refers to the psychological distance of climate change. It's a global problem. What should be your appropriate carbon price, given that it's a global coordination problem? How do you get a global regime? And particularly once you've defined it as just internalising an external damage, then it's effectively a burden-sharing structure, and a lot of theorists say, well, you can't really get 200 countries to agree on how to share burdens under such deep uncertainty and strategic risk management, with historical legacy about who's to blame and so forth. But also, and this will start to draw me more directly to the theme and focus of the policy aspects of the book, I've put there a quote from a social scientist who said there seems to be an inverse relationship between the typical prescription of policy analyst, which is broadly use competition and set a carbon price, with the political feasibility. That you can tell that was an academic speaking just by the verbology. One of the candidates for the Canadian premiership 10 years ago captured it rather more succinctly when he said, after losing the election, that carbon pricing is political suicide. That is quite a major problem. Fortunately, it was a little bit too bold, but it has to be said that carbon pricing as the solution has struggled tremendously in the real world for some fairly obvious reasons. So, let me now, against that broad backdrop, move into what, in a sense, we've emerged with as an analytic structure on energy that then starts to carry implications for maybe a more positive approach on how you can tackle these kinds of conjoined trilemma concerns. Let me start with something that may seem blindingly obvious, even if it's put up in a slightly odd way, which is a graph that simply says, consider the general proposition of economic theory, which is you have a resource input to the economy, and resource in the broadest possible terms here, it can mean in this case energy inputs or the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb CO2, etc., versus economic output. And obviously, for a single input, you have a curve. In fact, most textbooks would draw it as a straight line. The more resources input, the more output you can get. Very, very simple. What makes economics interesting is, of course, there's hundreds and thousands or millions of different economic inputs, and you're trying to actually simultaneously optimize against all of those inputs. And we well know that, frankly, central planners do a very, very poor job of that task, and markets tend to be a hell of a lot better, in which the price is the key information leverage and enables you to optimize and enables markets to optimize, which is broadly assuming that you have optimizing behavior that people will settle on all those resource curves somewhere on what you might call the best practice frontier. Yeah? So that's essentially, there are a set of, think of them as technologies, which define your ability to turn resource inputs into economic output. And the market is what enables consumption using the information of prices to make the best trade-offs. Now, in reality, what we tend to find is there are remarkably few optimizing decision makers, at least in this field. When you look closely, there seems to be lots of suboptimal behavior, Pareto suboptimal behavior. And that's true whether you think about actually individuals and look at how they make decisions on energy, I'll touch on that, or even companies. And for a while I was chief economist at the Carbon Trust, and it was astonishing how inefficient companies could be. Or indeed governments. How many people here think that governments are perfect optimising entities? So one thing we do in the book is just to clarify this space by saying, actually, economics already has a word for this. About 60 years ago, the term came in as satisficing behaviour, as a way of saying, well, somehow people seem to be sort of satisfied with not optimising. They say, oh, this is good enough, I can't be bothered to look around, etc., etc. I'll stay where I am, or it is a typical response. But there's a lot of satisficing behaviour out there. And there's perfectly good reasons for it. You have lots of debates about terminology, but the fact is, as compared with a best practice frontier, an awful lot of decision makers are some way short of it. In the book, we use the clarifying language that, well, we'll start with that real-world behaviour, and of course, this has been a huge boost in the last quarter of a century with the rise of behavioural economics and experimental economics and all that stuff. You stick people in labs, you analyse their behaviour and say, gee, these people are really not being fully rational and optimising. And also a lot of management theory about why and how organisations have principal-agent problems. All that stuff is what we call first-domain economics. So the terminology is that where you have a system which is effectively optimising, or at least where that's the assumption of the analysis, that's second-domain economics, that's broadly the stuff that typically becomes almost interchangeable with economics, which I think is sometimes a pity because the field is much broader. And then, of course, we know that frontier is moving. Technologies improve over time. They basically enable us to get more out of less. More output out of less input. Right. That's not very interesting. What is interesting is the question of, well, what determines how that technology frontier moves, or the best practice frontier moves? It tends to have a certain dynamic of what you might call business as usual innovation. And generally that innovation, absolutely more out of less, but also tends to sort of push you in that kind of direction, greater consumption of a whole range of resources. Where life gets much more interesting is when you say, well, how and in what direction is that curve moving and could be persuaded to move when you acknowledge that you might have goals in this system. And in particular, in this example, if you worry about carbon, well, you can squeeze on a carbon price, which will of course force decision makers down this and tend to accelerate innovation in that kind of carbon reduction direction, if this is carbon, is the resource you're talking about. But also, can you do things that would actually accelerate the technology frontier so that you don't end up making this trade-off? Because here, implicitly, I've drawn it deliberately so that there is a trade-off from putting on a carbon price, both immediately and in terms of, if you like, shifting innovation resources out of one sector and into another. Here is a query hypothesis: can you actually accelerate the innovation process? So there isn't a trade-off. And also, if you think about that trilemma, then innovation is effectively the way that you can either avoid or at least minimise trade-offs, because you're looking for technologies and systems which will improve things on all three fronts. Now, so the terminology in the book is that whole question of how a technology frontier moves is third domain economics, the economics of transformation, innovation, evolution of complex systems, and so forth. It's basically, if here you're assuming a static technology frontier, static preferences that define a nice, neat linear optimization problem, here all of that is changing, and life gets much more complicated. Now, the next point that we stress in this framework, we call it that, is following. So we're probably most familiar, at least the economists are most familiar with the optimizing domain, second domain, where broadly the key issues are relative prices, assuming representative agents, rational expectations, stable expectations on technologies and preferences. So we have well-developed tools in neoclassical and welfare economics. In the satisficing domain, the characteristics that research tends to emphasise are habits, myopia, inattention, intangible costs, contractual failures, principal agent failures. Risk aversion is a very big issue, or should we say risk inconsistency very frequently, to change or investment. And we've got the fields of behavioural and organisational economics as a sort of foundations in that. And then in the third domain, where you're looking at a shorthand as the transformation of systems, you're looking at structural, technological, institutional, behavioural change. And typically the decision-making domain here is often more to do with strategizing. It's judgment. This is where boards are really important. Boards are not there to actually say, oh no, that number was 2.3 rather than 2.6. Boards of major organisations tend to be, we think we need to go in that direction, develop that capacity, pursue those options, and what's our positioning in the kind of future we expect to have got. And into the systems level, there's a field of evolutionary and institutional economics. Maybe one point to make here that I found very interesting when I joined Ofgem, which is actually coming up for 5 years ago. I found just about everyone in Ofgem was familiar with that. It's a regulator, we do competition. Fine, really easy. A lot of people in Ofgem were also getting fairly familiar with behavioural and organisational economics, because they had to deal with the lack of switching in the consumer market and sticky customers and all that. Very few had even heard of evolutionary economics and had a vague idea of institutional economics. But they're quite substantial disciplines. The essential point in this is that these are not, and this is where I think I find academia sometimes so frustrating, because it sometimes feels like a battleground between camps that pursue those lines of research. In effect, what we're saying is, or concluded in this, was the distinguishing feature here is they simply describe different processes that dominated different scales in the systems, different social scales. So typically in that first domain you're looking at individuals or small organisations, and down here you're looking at market structures, sectors, even countries. Here you're frequently looking at the diffusion of technologies, ideas, structures over decades internationally, and ultimately the global transformation. And similarly on the time horizon, typical paybacks time horizons in that first domain, a year or two at most. Generally, when you're doing market calculations, discount rate returns, etc., you're looking at somewhere between maybe a couple of years and a couple of decades. And when you're looking at the timescales of transformation, at least in any sort of physically intensive sector like energy, you're looking at half a century easily for major structural transformation systems. So it's different processes that dominate at different scales that you're looking at, and in that sense, they're not alternative explanations. They're all perfectly true, but you just can't take tools from one and assume that it applies to every problem in the whole system. So where does that lead us in terms of policy? What does it imply about what government should do? Well, again, if you start with where in a sense we're most obvious and comfortable, if you think about the optimization domain, clearly markets and prices are where you can inject effective competition, where you can get prices right, they're the most effective way of allocating resources. And in that sense, maximising competition in the energy sector, introducing carbon price, a security price or a capacity market to protect security is the obvious route to try and go down. Now, markets and prices will have knock-on effects on the other domains. Bump up the price high enough, boy, you can stop people satisficing and get them to pay attention to their energy bills. But it's a pretty blunt instrument. You absolutely have a strong carbon price, and you will affect the relative economics of investing in high or low carbon innovation. So that's what the high, medium and low involves. But centrally, what you're trying to do most obviously is switch choices towards cleaner products and processes. If what you want to do is to get to grips with the satisficing domain, to get people closer to the technology frontier, then actually what you find is the tools, all of this is obviously slightly stylised, but the tools broadly that have been effective are standards or engagement. Either you simply say, look, buildings can be much more efficient, nobody does a full lifetime cost optimization of the energy when they build a building, setting a building standard to make sure it's properly insulated, etc. Similarly with refrigerators, many cold appliances, standards have been extremely effective and extremely cost effective. But there's areas where, and there's certainly limitations to how you do that, at which point you also want to be reaching for, can you do something to engage consumers, get them to pay more attention, get them to understand, actually do you realise how much energy you're wasting? If what you're trying to do is transform, the shorthand for that was the combination, particularly of those two elements, you're trying to get smarter choices. If what you're trying to do is transform the system, then there is, in my view, an inescapable role for what we term strategic investment, which is actually very easy to define. Basically, any investment which yields a positive public return that is higher than any individual market actor could get for themselves. And of course, put like that, there's loads of opportunities. I mean, a lot of innovation we recognise, it's why governments fund R&D, most infrastructure, education, loads of stuff can potentially have a higher public than private return, and government therefore has a legitimate role in trying to foster it. But that's the kind of policy matrix. And so I know I've maybe belaboured the point, but we go through in the book to try and say, okay, here's a way of structuring it, here's some policy implications. The next question, in a sense, is how much does this matter? Because you could argue, and I read a book on behavioural economics, a critical book, which said, yeah, maybe there's some truth in this stuff, but frankly it's pretty marginal compared with real economics. I hope you'll pick up a bit as I go through the remainder of the talk as to at least some of the data and thinking which led us to say, you know what, if we're actually trying to really get to grips strategically with these trilemma, all three of these are, at first order, equally important in policy terms. Now, I'm going to zero in, I mean, there's lots I could say. There's basically, it ended up as a huge book. It's over 500 pages, just as a warning. There's 3 chapters on each of those 3 domain stroke pillars. I'm going to skip entirely the detail on the first and second. I just want to put up a couple of things on this third pillar. Why because, well, partly because one can't cover everything, but also because this, I think, is an area where there has been a particular degree of confusion, contention, disagreement, partly within the government, between, on the one hand, Treasury, and on the other, both DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, and often BIS. And I think a bit more clarity around what are we talking about and arguing about here could help. As I indicated, ultimately, only innovation can deliver all three of those trilemma components simultaneously. Unfortunately, where you're looking for innovation is in some of the least innovative sectors in our whole entire economies. What this chart shows is the R&D intensity in different sectors. So IT and pharmaceuticals spend between 10 and 15% of their turnover on research and development. I should say, by the way, I was astonished in writing this book. I thought, I'll go and find this data. I'll go and find some paper analysing cross-sectoral differences. Couldn't find anything. We had to go to primary data. There's lots of detailed specialists in innovation in these different sectors. There seemed to be very little standing back and saying, actually, you know, there's a huge discrepancy. So the sectors in this context were interested in gas, electricity, industrial metals, because they're huge energy consumers, construction, because of building energy. So, guys, what we're after is radical innovation in approximately the four least innovative sectors, 4 or 5, if you take this measure, which spend less than 1/20th as much of their turnover on R&D as compared with the sectors we think of as being highly innovative. Now, unless you have a clear acknowledgement, understanding and explanation of that, simply saying, well, you throw carbon price at the problem and then it will be solved, is clearly slightly missing the point. You need to understand what's going on here. To delve into that, it is very useful to look more closely at the innovation process. Economics for a long time, I think ever since Schumpeter, has acknowledged that you can split the process into invention, which is, hey, I've got an interesting new idea here, innovation, which is, I'm going to turn this into a marketable product that will deliver some service to somebody, and diffusion, which is the process of that product rolling out. When you look more closely, I actually think it's one of these sort of fractal type problems. The more closely you look at any bit of this, the more you can break it down into components. The bit that I think is particularly policy challenging is breaking out the innovation component, in which you're really looking at applied research and development, turning an idea into potential product, demonstration that thing can actually work, some indication of what costs might be, the commercialization process of actually building a business around a physical thing and showing that you can actually sell a product that works and won't fall over, accumulation of market to build up supply chain, scale economies, learning by doing, etc., and diffusion. And the key point is here, you're in a process in which at this end it's very directly dependent upon government support. Government R&D funding dominates. Here, ultimately, you want it driven by the market. All the stages in between, you really want some combination. And it never ceases to amaze me, the number of people who seem to think that you can completely separate these, that you kind of have a carbon price here, and you'll have public research and development here, and hey presto, you'll solve the problem. If you think about it, what is the marginal cost? Say we're talking about low carbon innovation. What's the marginal cost of saving from R&D investment in terms of sort of pounds per tonne of CO2? And the answer is, well, it's kind of infinite, because you're creating a product that's not being used. During this process, you are trying to develop the technologies and start to diffuse them out such that it brings down the marginal cost as the industry develops. And that if you expect a technology to just jump from an infinite marginal cost into competing with incumbent industries that have been there for a century, then you're going to be very disappointed. I'll come back to that in just a second, because the missing key part of the story is, so why have we gone into this and developed this whole framework in the context of energy? And I think there may be some reasons. I mean, I'm well aware every sector can claim to be different, and in a sense every sector is different. In energy, I think that and this coming back to some of the work, a bit in Ofgem, scratching our heads about low consumer engagement and so forth. I'd say there are key characteristics on both the consumer and the producer end. On the consumer end, there's no product differentiation, right? So you do all your innovation, you do come up with some great new way of generating electricity, and you go to the market and say, guys, consumers, I've got a wonderful, sexy new electron which looks exactly the same as every other electron you can buy. Just think about the profit margins that Apple made producing the iPhone. You cannot have huge margins for producing a sexy new way of making electrons that are exactly the same to the final consumers. So the lack of product differentiation, and macroeconomics now recognises this is a very important driver of innovation in the sector. Secondly, it is incidental, not a deliberative consumption. How many of you got up this morning and thought, I'm going to go and buy a new electron today? It doesn't really work like that. I mean, we just do stuff that consumes energy, and the cost is usually very unclear at the moment of use. Similarly in linked, it's a continuous product. Don't go down to the shop to buy it when we've run out. Therefore, there's no point at which you focus on the need to buy more. And it's an essential service, so government can't realistically step in and say, if you don't change your provider, we're going to switch you off. You cannot force decision making. So disengaged consumers, to any psychologist or behavioural economist, is actually really not surprising at all. It's all the characteristics that would lead to disengagement. Meanwhile, on the production characteristic side of it, usually substantial long-lived capital-intensive assets. The finance industry keep calling it infrastructure, and then energy people get confused because they think infrastructure is the networks, and a power station that may last 50 years is just an investment. A quirk, and this is primarily electricity, and I won't dwell on this much, but one of the great achievements in electricity is establishing a market. The market is short-run, spot price, marginal cost pricing to a large degree, driven by plants that have different operating costs. Well, obviously the price gets set by the most expensive unit on the system, which is always a fossil fuel plant, because renewables and nuclear cost very, very little to run, with the slight quirk that the price of the product will get driven by the fossil fuels. Is completely unrelated to the cost of that baseload stuff. So the most capital-intensive investments are all price takers in what is a highly volatile market, which is a paradox in the sense that if you're running a gas plant, you can kind of afford the risk because, gas prices go up, well, the electricity price will go up. It's not as simple as that, particularly gas versus coal. The same with the carbon price. Carbon price will tend to drive up those costs, and that, in effect, you're saying, put in huge amounts of baseload capital for a highly uncertain return. So you have a problem in where risks gets allocated as compared with the kind of transition trying to drive. You have a dependence upon regulated networks because the transmission system is a natural monopoly, so it's dependence upon regulation. And I once had an interesting conversation with a senior executive at BP. It's about 8-10 years ago. They were we're discussing offshore wind energy, which involves a lot of big offshore engineering, sticking lots of steel in stormy waters, and British industry par excellence has expertise. So I said, why is BP not getting involved in offshore wind energy? You've got all the consultants' reports. And he said, oh, well, you're asking the right person. I led our study of that. And I said, oh, right, OK, so basically do you not believe the consultants' reports, that it's engineering feasible, etc.? He said, oh, no, they were fine. They were fine. Just that after 2 years, we concluded we're not an electricity company. And well, I was sort of thinking, but if there's business in it. He said, no, it's very simple. He said, in oil, we'll risk £5 billion in a number of different explorations. One of them strikes well, we'll make 10 billion. We figure if we have the same success in offshore engineering, the government will change the rules and take the money away from us. Very simple. Risk reward. This is not a high risk, high return industry. So we ain't going to take high risks. And therefore, hence, low innovation. And also there's high externalities, so the whole operating environment depends on what do governments do about internalisation of environment, security, etc. concerns. So that's a sort of backdrop for this combination. This graphic tries to combine the data I showed you earlier, which I flipped on its side, and now split out, saying there seem to be three broad categories. One are industries where you have a vibrant connection of an innovation system of relatively rapid, low-cost invention, innovation, and highly engaged consumers wanting and paying a lot more for a new, interesting product. Then you have a lot of business-to-business engagement, and then you have sort of utility-type areas where, in effect, you're characterised by what everyone in the field tends to call the technology valley of death, which is that governments keep pumping some money into R&D, hoping something will emerge, and it never does, and they end up rather disappointed. Now, what that implies is the economics of this are quite interesting, because there's a big divergence between the strategic economics, which is broadly, if you think about the money that went into North Sea oil, it was huge. The amount of money this country invested in North Sea oil in the 1970s, about £5 billion a year for a decade. But the returns were enormous. And that sector, you could privatise quite a lot of those returns, though the government was still very deeply involved. This graphic, incidentally, tries to give a three-dimensional sense of the cost of a technology, I won't go into detail, the cost of a technology, time and market size, and effectively the volume of investment is represented by cost differential times time times market size, and the benefits likewise, which can be huge and would be substantially enhanced by a carbon price. But it's incredibly hard for any private entity to recognise even a fraction of those strategic benefits, which is why we have this whole debate about feed-in tariffs for renewable energy, big market supports to try and pull technologies through this valley of death. So, if I move towards this sort of quick run through of some generic implications, and I stress the generic points, I'll be pretty brief about this. Second, back to the bigger theme of the book, this three domains architecture. First thing to say is, even though it looked like first and third domains are at opposite ends, and in many ways they are, they have quite a lot in common. First, typically responses are non-linear. They tend to be threshold effects, which can be quite strong. These are not inherently optimizing. I mean, the whole definition of first domain behavior is these entities are not optimizing. And likewise, the innovation space is not optimizing. I could say a lot more about the way in which it's not optimizing. You get substantial divergence between private and public returns, consequently dependent frequently on government policy, and also progress is largely irreversible. Like you put insulation in someone's house, the energy price could go to zero, and the chances are they wouldn't bother taking it out again, for example. You make an innovation, and generally you don't forget it next year or have to spend the same R&D again. So these are not sort of, where are you on the curve according to relative prices. These are what progress have you made that's then embedded in the system. But they are obviously very different in underlying processes, timescales, key actors, and the nature of risks. In terms of the macroeconomic point of this, we include a penultimate chapter in the book, which we brought in. This is where partly Jean-Charles brought in macroeconomics, where we linked it to the sort of 50-year-old debate about growth theory and the fact that the neoclassical solo growth theory, which is based on capital accumulation and so forth, actually could never explain the rate of economic growth actually observed. And I was aware of some of the debates in what then has become for the 50 years known as the solo residual, which in the book we call the dark matter of economic growth, because it's much harder to observe and quantify. And I was really quite struck when at the Government Economic Service annual conference, Tim Besley gave the keynote lecture, and he said, well, what we've really come to conclude that it's about two primary things. This solo residual, the unexplained elements of economic growth, or unquantified, partly reducing structurally resource misallocation and technological advancement. In other words, in different language, the first and third domains that I spoke about are really sort of a way of thinking about the elements of the solo residual in economic growth theory. And yet, they remain largely absent in models, because they are blooming difficult to model, and rather poorly charted in policy. Not non-existent, but just like we kind of continually feel we're muddling our way through how best to deal with these things. For the mathematically minded amongst you, you didn't really worry about this equation or what they mean. All it is saying, generally, you want some kind of equation which is saying you have cost of this and this and this and this and this and this, and you want to minimise the total costs. In this example, I think it's like fossil fuel, non-fossil fuel investment, climate damage, other stuff. The key point here is that if you are dealing purely with second domain economics, with fixed technology frontiers and so forth, you have a conceptually easy way of solving that. Assuming you have a universal market-oriented discount rate, you equalise marginal costs, which means you can separate those components. And your optimum is then defined mathematically in terms of the partial derivative of each of those things separately. Unfortunately, when you are thinking about this whole process of innovation, everything kind of affects everything else. You have different actors with widely divergent timescales. And you're trying to minimise the costs of overall scenarios in a context of uncertainty, option value, etc. So it's a much, much more complicated optimisation problem. And you cannot necessarily assume that cost A is separable from cost B or is separable from its scale, etc. So mathematically, what that means is really what you're trying to get at is, if I change one of these components, how does the whole thing change, including this knockover impact on everything else? I don't want to dwell further, but I just found that for some people that was a kind of useful way of encapsulating the difference. Now, I said I would mention this rather odd phrase of interdisciplinary economics. This, I confess, we don't actually mention in the book, because that only dawned on me a bit later, that what it's really implying, and I had some pushback from non-economic audiences saying, well, you're not talking about economics. I mean, you can put this label on behavioural economics, but psychologists have been talking about this for ages. And it's kind of true. You cannot understand the first domain stuff without understanding social and psychological dimensions of how real people behave. And you can argue whether that is something that should be colonised by behavioural economics or just say it's another discipline. And also, in this third domain, I think it is important to stress that innovation is incredibly powerful, but it cannot change the laws of physics. We cannot assume that just by throwing money at R&D we'll come up with some magical new energy source. Actually, we know pretty well what the energy resources are available. The question is how good can we be at converting. If we had time to go into the UK example, I'd draw on that a little bit. And both of those are strongly affected by regulatory and institutional dimensions. There is a wider analogy to be drawn. I think I've only got one more slide of the sort of the main book material, which is perhaps a bit pretentious, but it did remind me, and I was originally trained in physics, of a little bit like a century ago we had these huge debates in physics, which for 2 centuries had been all neoclassical all Newtonian mechanics, basically explained everything in the universe. And it was when you got to look at the really small, you actually realised it just didn't work anymore, and you had to invent quantum mechanics. And then when you looked at the really big, you needed to wait for Einstein to come along and develop relativity theory about what happens at really big scales, where different processes dominate. And as we drew this whole exercise to a close, it felt a little bit like that. And the reason why this ended up a theme in the book about interface of energy and climate change is these are problems that combine the individual decision-making of 7 billion people on the planet with respect to how they really use energy and do or do not generally optimise it, right through to the transformation of some of the most complicated strategic networked systems we've ever developed over the course of the entire century with respect to a global risk. And the final thing in the book, so what on earth has Seneca got to do with it? It's simply that one of my colleagues pointed out a quote which, I don't know how many Latin scholars there are, but to make the English snappy, we turn the sentence around. It's basically saying, no wind is favourable if you have no idea where you're trying to go. And there is a sense in which quite a lot of the confusion in energy policy debates has been, well, should we bother to know where we are? Or do we just have a market and that will deliver it? Well, no, actually, what about? Oh, what about, So if you've got some sense of where you think the system needs to go to, then you can pick up the trends which are favourable, the market designs which suit, etc. But the thing that comes through, and this graphic may or may not help to capture, is when you look at the energy systems people, energy systems modelers, what they're really saying is, this is not an issue about marginal change in cost. This is an issue about we can construct a whole global energy future based around fossil fuels, finding more fossil fuels, unconventional synthetic oil and transport, coal to gas liquids. Generally, this is somewhat lower capital cost but higher fuel dependence, a host of potentially environmental issues, or you can try to construct green futures, which are not higher cost version of brown futures. They are structurally very different. And in fact, personally, I would argue, we don't have a clue which is actually more expensive. And it may be an almost irrelevant question, because a lot will depend upon how smart and effective are you at fostering that third pillar, that third dimension of structural change and innovation in these systems. But the more you look at them, the more these look very different kinds of energy systems. And in that sense, that was why we came back and used the Seneca quote in the final chapter of the book, which is, you can't really separate the question of where are you trying to get to from what is effective policy across these multiple domains. So that was broadly the structure of the book, the thinking of the book. It's a slightly unconventional approach, but I hope it's one you found of interest. Like I say, I kind of feel that's maybe the big picture stuff I wanted to cover. I'm very happy to go on to 2 other slides about UK applications, as long as it's understood I'm wearing my academic hat, not my Ofgem hat. Shall I take questions there, or do you want the last UK-specific bits? Strong views.
I'd rather get questions if that's all right.
Sure.
Can I ask one?
Absolutely. That's the idea. I figured I've already been talking for too long. So.
Matt Georges from the Environment Agency. How does the... I have to say, I found that incredibly useful, like a really good way of organising a lot of different thoughts that have been kind of bouncing around my own head, and it was useful to have that structure. How does that play into megatrends? Things like an increasingly ageing population in the global north, increasing population full stop. You've got issues around, I remember, I think it was BP who looked into the future, and they basically see 2 ways that the global economy is going, either towards resource nationalism, as they called it, or towards a kind of continued open market, and increasing inequality as well. We just had a recent Oxfam report on that, and the more unequal, it makes it very difficult to implement policies that increase prices if you've got a lot of people who are very poor, basically.
Yeah.
So have you got any sense of how what you've looked at fits into those really big global trends at all?
Well, I think one thing that's true is the further ahead you look, the more interconnected all these things start to seem. And it is striking at the extent to which in these sort of energy futures world, you have people talking about scenarios, and Shell have sort of made their name by insisting that the scenarios are absolutely fundamental if you're in the energy business, and that scenarios are not a prediction. They are a tool for trying to understand structurally different ways in which the future could develop, but in ways that are internally consistent, and hence the kind of scenarios you mapped out. I can't say we've gone into huge depth about them, other than I think there are some fascinating linkages with issues about ageing population and the interface of the financial system. And what I mean by that is, I don't want to get sucked too deep into this terrain. We have a real oddity that people are living longer and longer. There are more and more sort of concerns about pension, etc. More and more emphasis upon savings for retirement. Which a lot of it, which is accumulating on what's called, it's a big aspect of institutional finance. And you look at the world around you and you discover that what broadly the markets want is a kind of 10% rate of return. You have trillions sitting in institutional finance, locked up because they're protected by pension rules or insurance rules, that is earning diddly squat, like 1% if you're lucky. And then you look at this problem and think, well, a lot of the debate about both climate change is a debate about what's your timescales and discount rate. A lot of the debate about the cost of different energy sources is fundamentally not actually how costly are those energy sources, it's what's your discount rate and your risk allocation. But, you know, if you're a pensioner, you could argue that one thing is you know you're going to consume energy in 30 or 40 years' time, and actually you could get a much better deal by investing in renewable energy than by investing in a pension scheme. You put some capital in up front, and most of these things are very good at a 3 or 4% rate of return. They're just really bad at a 10% rate of return, so industry don't go and do it in a... So that's where I see some aspects of linkages. Obviously, the population issue is also a driver of the scale of the problem overall. I mean, ultimately, the planet doesn't actually care about how energy efficient we are per GDP, it just cares about how much we emitted in physical total, which is a product of population and intensity per capita, etc. Sorry, I think I've done a rather poor job of answering a very big question.
It was too big to answer, probably.
Yeah.
There was useful stuff there about the capital markets.
Just maybe the other point of linkage is there is a really emerging almost discipline about nexus issues, nexus between energy, land, water in particular are seen to be increasingly intimately connected and real tensions and trade-offs based on current technologies. And climate, of course, yeah.
How would you kind of operationalise this in terms of advice for policy making? When you know, more or less dismissed it just in inverted commas said the significance of carbon pricing, etc. But we're really emphasising importance of the role of regulation, etc. And so, can you just elucidate a little bit where you think policy direction should be in trying to get to grips with these trilemmas?
Okay. Maybe first I should say, if I sounded like I dismissed carbon pricing, I apologise. That was not what I meant to do at all. I think it's actually really important, but it is really difficult. And I think one of the solutions to its difficulty is to understand its role in relation to these other pillars. Let me actually pick up one of the things I put in the annex. I use frequently in this was how these different pillars are interrelated, which I hope will speak to a bit on the carbon pricing issue. If you think about one of the aspects, and this is really the concluding chapter of the book, is so how do these things stitch together? And the ultimate argument is one of the reasons we've made so little progress is because we've had people in these different silos not actually recognising the interrelationships. So energy efficiency, one of the key things is it doesn't only make people more efficient, it reduces their bills and potentially makes them more responsive to higher prices that might emerge if you're trying to price carbon. And in fact, there is significant empirical evidence that energy bills in the long run are more or less unchanged with respect to energy prices. So the long run elasticity is approximately -1. 10% higher energy prices in a country, cross-country comparison, means 10% less energy consumption means same bills. That's a very important political message if it's true. It's only true when you realise that it's emerged because countries that have faced really high energy prices, like Japan, have done a lot on all three pillars. It's not been a purely consumer-driven response. But the efficiency leg can actually help you manage the bill impact of rising prices and create a narrative around that. Rising prices, in turn, the carbon price certainly will generate revenues. I think there's a legitimate debate, personally, around potential earmarking some of that, because basically what I'm saying is this combination is an extreme... These issues are an extreme combination of public bads and public goods. And there is a certain logic to taxing the bads to fund the goods. But also the market pricing will help to reveal the costs of technologies emerging from the innovation process and increase the strategic value of low carbon options. In return, the technology options generated will enable people to respond more effectively to rising prices and industry to have a better prospect of maintaining its competitiveness in the face of rising prices. In fact, really the debate in Europe is increasingly moving to recognise that heavy industry in Europe has a structural problem. They've kind of stopped blaming carbon pricing because, frankly, carbon prices are too low to make any difference. They have a structural competitiveness problem. Structurally, Europe has higher energy prices than the new world economies for reasons we can't do much about. So competitive innovation is a key driver in competitiveness. And in turn, rising energy prices will increase the attention of consumers to address the satisficing effects. The combination will provide products and maybe finance energy efficiency, retrofit homes and that kind of thing. So I see the whole thing as an integrated narrative with an absolutely essential role for carbon pricing. But it's just not the one says we just need to hit consumers as hard as we can with higher prices and in the end the buggers will do what they should do. That just does not work politically. It's a dead end politically. We need a more sophisticated narrative around the role of pricing, is my view. I hope that's answered your question. I should have actually said, sorry, for those, anyone interested, I'll leave some leaflets and a summary on the side. I'll probably forget it. Sorry, that wasn't intended to. Other questions?
Just really interested in a couple of things you mentioned in passing there. Fascinating talk throughout, but you mentioned that Japan has had very high energy prices generally, and that Europe tends to have structurally higher energy prices than the USA, but we can't do much about it. Why is that?
Basically because, first of all, in the course of industrial development over 2 or 3 centuries, Europe has used most of the cheapest coal resources. It's much higher population density, therefore land prices are higher. You have more public opposition to overcome in developing new resources. Whereas you look at the population density of the US, land prices in the US, or even more so Latin America, it's just a different world. So it's fundamental physical drivers on the whole.
And what about Japan?
Well, Japan, absolutely. I mean, it's always been worried, troubled by the fact that it's got very few natural energy resources and is highly import dependent. And one reason for Japan's approach at the opening of the Second World War was to try and strike strategically to address its resource dependency before any other aspect of the war developed in the Second World War. So for Japan, a deep sense of its own energy insecurity. Hence also the government's sort of desperation to get their nuclear program relaunched, etc.
Maybe we should have gone for questions after all.
I know, that's good. I can't remember. We're supposed to finish at 12:30 or 1? Or is it after the audience?
About now, actually, so if we don't have any questions. Just wait for close. Thank you very much. Coming along to this GESR seminar day, I'm Andrew Heron, working with the GESR team. So today we've got John Peasland from MOJ here to talk to us about incentivising reductions in reoffending through payment by results. It's a very interesting topic, and sort of the payment by results model also being sort of copied elsewhere. For example, I know it's been used to test in DWP for various things, so it's sort of there's growing interest in it, so this should be quite interesting from a policy point of view. But I won't take up your time, I'll hand straight over to John.
So as Nick said, I'm John Peasland from the Ministry of Justice. I worked on this a couple of years ago, so I might be a bit shaky on some of the detail, but hopefully we can let you know what was kind of really interesting bit of work at MOJ over the last 2-3 years. And I think there is probably a lot that could be learned by us if we were to do it again, but also if this kind of model is used elsewhere in government. That said, it's very live at the moment, so we don't exactly know how it's working, but we'll kind of get to that in the end. So as I said, I'm going to talk about something called the Transforming Rehabilitation Programme. This was really the biggest piece of policy in the Ministry of Justice from kind of late 2012 to early last year when it kind of concluded and we ended up kind of having transformed rehabilitation, if you like, and kind of went on from there. Essentially what it is it's competing most of the probation services in England and Wales. So I'll talk a bit about what probation is, but it's a key way kind of offenders are managed by the Ministry of Justice. And now I'll talk a bit kind of about what the PVR mechanism is we used, what kind of some of the things we considered in developing it were. So firstly, what's probation? Well, there's many different ways that the courts can sentence offenders, and probation can be a part of those different sentences. So at the lowest end, the courts can kind of discharge people or give them a fine, and actually that's the majority of sentences passed down by the courts. Probation can be used kind of as a sentence in its own right, so a community sentence or a suspended sentence order, where offenders have to kind of meet regularly with a probation officer. They might have requirements to undertake in terms of substance misuse treatment programs, or more punitive stuff like unpaid work. So you might see offenders kind of clearing litter off roundabouts and things like that. So that would all fall under kind of probation. But it's also part of a custodial sentence. So custody is reserved for kind of the most serious offenders. Typically, an offender will be sentenced to custody, say they get a 4-year sentence, they'll spend 2 years in prison, they'll be released at the halfway point, and then spend 2 years on something called licence, which is effectively probation supervision, trying to keep them out of trouble until the end of their sentence. Worth noting, a key aspect of this reform that I'll kind of come to was introducing this licence period to offenders that are sentenced to short sentences, so prison sentences under 12 months. So before February last year, if someone was sentenced to 8 months in prison, they'd serve 4 months, they'd go out in the community, and that'll be that, effectively. So just by way of context, probation caseload is just over 200,000 offenders at any one time. By comparison, kind of the prison population is about 85,000 prisoners. And it cost, before we did these reforms, about 800 million per year. So in the context of MOJ's budget, which is ever diminishing, but is around 6 billion, it's a decent chunk of our work. So why did we want to reform probation? So really, the case was around reoffending. And particularly for that group I mentioned, kind of the offenders that are sentenced to under 12 months in prison. So you see here, top line, the green one, is the reoffending rate within 1 year of release from prison for those sentenced to under 12 months. So we're getting 60% of these people back within a year, which suggests something isn't really working in the system. The other two lines, so the blue one is all custodial sentences. So actually, the longer you sentence people to custody, the lower their reoffending rates tend to be, which is due to a combination of factors. And then court orders, so your community sentence, if you like, a much lower reoffending rate themselves. Across both court orders and custody, the average kind of reoffences per reoffender is nearly 4 per year, so about 3.6. So these people come out of prison or come off the end of a community order and they reoffend 4 times per year. So it's really kind of the argument for doing something was around reoffending. You can see these rates have been fairly stable, at least for the last 7 or 8 years. So the key elements, so I've spoken a bit about the kind of the introducing the licence for the under 12-month group, but there are a couple of other things that's worth being aware of. So before we did these transforming rehabilitation reforms, probation was organised in 35 trusts in England and Wales. They were publicly operated, kind of managed by the National Offender Management Service, NOMS. A key element of the transforming rehabilitation reforms was to split the management of probation into 2 different parts. So something called the National Probation Service, which looks after about 20% of offender starts. That's for high-risk offenders. So those offenders that are kind of the top end of the risk of reoffending and of probation. So these have remained in public operation. They're in 7 different areas across the country, but they now also provide licence periods for those offenders sentenced to under 12 months in prison. The key bit we're interested in terms of PBR, are community rehabilitation companies. So this was a new thing as a result of these reforms. They look after low and medium risk offenders. So that's about 80% of offender starts. And they operate 21 areas across England and Wales. And effectively, what TR was about, as well as this split, was competing the provision of services in those 21 areas under kind of PBR contracts. So that split happened in summer 2014, and then then the competition happened. So initially, the community rehabilitation companies were in public operation for about 8 or 9 months, and then we did the competition. They went out into private operation. So, what were we looking to do in developing a PBR payment mechanism for these services? So there's a number of different things. I've kind of spoken about reducing reoffending. That's obviously the main driver we had. Kind of one of the things which will of course affect that is how big an incentive we provide for the CRCs, the community rehabilitation companies, to actually go out there and reduce reoffending. So second bullet there is kind of offering a reasonable rate of return for a reasonable reduction in reoffending. And I'll come on a bit later to kind of talk about what that means. Obviously, we wanted to avoid perverse incentives, particularly the potential to kind of park the hardest offenders to work with and just kind of work with those that are particularly easy. And obviously, we wanted it to be affordable. So this is kind of the very basic payment structure, and then I'll kind of go into how we've done the PBR bit in particular. So effectively, for the competition for the delivery of these services, MOJ set 2 thresholds, if you like. So the lower one there is something called maximum fee for service. So that's effectively a price threshold. So that's just the price that providers kind of bid during the competition. We also set something called a maximum annual payment. And the difference between the two is effectively your minimum amount of PBR. So in setting up the competition, we wanted to make sure there would definitely be a PBR incentive for providers. So we set this kind of maximum annual payment a reasonable level above the maximum fee for service to ensure kind of a minimum payment by results amount of money available. The bidders could then bid kind of anywhere they liked below that blue line. So there's clearly an incentive for them in a competitive environment to bid a lower price. They're also judged on quality, but all else equal, to bid a lower price, which would therefore allow an increased amount of PBR available, which would result in a greater incentive to reduce reoffending. So here's an example. So say somebody actually put their bid in that yellow block, then that would mean there's kind of more PBR available than the minimum we were setting as a department. So what are some of the key features of the PBR payments? We'll come on to have a look at what the actual mechanisms look like. But I mentioned earlier that we were really keen to avoid kind of the perverse incentive of parking difficult to deal with offenders. And the way we tried to get around that is by having 2 payment mechanisms effectively on for PBR. And I'll come and show you what they look like. But reoffending can be measured in a couple of different ways. So I mentioned earlier the kind of the binary rate of reoffending. So that's purely the proportion of all offenders that reoffend within a year of either their release from prison or they're starting on a community centre. So we wanted to measure that. We wanted to look at complete desistance from crime. So that's what that one measures. But if you just focus on the binary measure, then providers would have an incentive just to work with those that are kind of close to giving up anyway, who were on the threshold of not reoffending. And all of those that are kind of going out there committing 10, 15, 20 reoffences within a year of their sentence would potentially be parked. So we had a frequency measure that we were also interested in. So this is the one I mentioned earlier in terms of reoffences per reoffender. So if actually somebody, in the absence of kind of my work with them, would have gone on to reoffend 6 times, but I can't quite stop them completely, but they only go on to reoffend 3 times as a result of all the work I'm doing with them. That's still a better outcome for MOJ and society, so we wanted to kind of incentivise that as well. So that's why we've got kind of these 2 measures that we're interested in. We split the money available 50-50 between the 2. And the last, but it's kind of a bit obvious really, but obviously you get paid more if you reduce reoffending more, up to kind of a cap of which we could afford, and then we would also deduct providers if they allow reoffending to increase. So when we were kind of setting up the payment mechanisms, we had to have a really as good a sense as we could of what is a reasonable reduction in reoffending. So you'll have seen from one of the earlier charts, actually reoffending's been pretty flat for a long time. So clearly, kind of there's not a lot necessarily to take from recent practice, if you like. Actually, when you look a bit closer into some of the sub-cohorts where specific interventions have been tried in smaller geographic areas or particular prisons, there is a reasonable amount of evidence that we can use to gauge kind of what we think a reasonable reduction in reoffending is. So a few examples there, but essentially kind of synthesising all of that, we thought around a 3 percentage point reduction in the binary rate of reoffending was a reasonable kind of level for a provider to aim for, and around 0.25 reoffences per reoffender. So here we'll have a look at actually kind of what the payment mechanisms looked like themselves. So I said there's 2. This is the first one. This is the binary payment mechanism. So fairly simple, really. You can see kind of towards the top right of the diagram, you're in a position where reductions in reoffending are getting larger. Payments are obviously bigger in that direction as well. Correspondingly, kind of towards the bottom left, there's a small area where a provider would face deductions, but then there's kind of this looming termination trigger, which I'll talk a bit more about for larger increases in reoffending. So I guess the most distinctive feature, I guess, or one that provokes the most interest is this flat area in the middle. So why have we got that, and what does it actually mean? So that flat area, kind of a payment gap, if you like, in an area where there's no reward and no deduction for small increases or decreases in reoffending. So why did we set that? Well, really there was a desire to kind of for providers to demonstrate that they'd made kind of a genuine effort and actual kind of result in reducing reoffending before they were paid for doing so. So there is some volatility, just kind of natural volatility in reoffending rates. You might have small local changes in policing and things like that, which can affect reoffending rates. So there is going to be a difference between what a provider kind of actually does, almost their underlying kind of how much they should be paid for their underlying work, how much they kind of on average would reduce reoffending with the same amount of work, and then what we actually observe, which is going to take into account all kind of the idiosyncratic local factors that may be around. So this kind of flat area, which we set as an 80% confidence interval based on historic variations in reoffending, is there for that purpose. It gives MOJ some certainty, well, greater certainty, that any paid-for reduction in reoffending actually reflects a genuine improvement on the part of the provider. So this payment mechanism I've shown here is kind of illustrative in terms of the width of that gap. It varies from area to area based on their historic reoffending volatility. But in every area, you can see kind of the 3 percentage point area, target, if you like, that I mentioned earlier, the reasonable reduction in reoffending, is kind of well beyond that. So we did spend quite a lot of time looking at different confidence intervals. So what would happen if you set it at 95%, 90%? And the wider we set it, the closer it gets towards that 3 percentage point reduction, and it just reduces the expected value for a provider for what is kind of what we would deem a reasonable reduction in reoffending, because of the volatility, you'd be falling down that kind of this little cliff edge here a fair amount. So we kind of did quite a lot of work looking at how we could really optimise exactly how we kind of set that. But I'll come on to some of the cons. So there's pros and cons, I think, with this approach, and I'll come on to flip side as well. So some of the other key features, I said kind of it's capped at the top right. So the payment equivalent to that cap is kind of half of the PBR available that I spoke about in terms of the basic payment structure. And then in terms of how we actually work out the payment for a provider in any given period, so their payment equals the change in the rate of reoffending times the number of offenders that started in their cohort. So together those things are the number of offenders that stopped offending, and 4,000 times £4,000, which I'll kind of come to again a bit later about why we chose £4,000. But that's kind of some of the key features. But you'll also kind of notice kind of a kinked payment mechanism possibly offers perverse incentives. So this was something we were really mindful of in kind of in setting this up, and something external stakeholders commented on as well. So in theory, and probably in practice, it's costly to reduce reoffending. So a provider has to invest money to kind of get some of that payment towards the right-hand side of the diagram. So similarly, they could disinvest in the services and save money. And because we've got a flat bit there, there's theoretically a potential that the best outcome for a provider could be to kind of aim for that deduction threshold. These are kind of illustrative ISO profit curves, with obviously profit is going to be increasing towards the top left of the diagram, where payments are higher and costs are lower. So that was something we were kind of mindful of in setting this up, and I'll kind of talk a little bit now about how we kind of avoided, or we think we've avoided that risk to a large extent. And the key thing is this kind of termination trigger, which I've highlighted there. Does that all make sense? I'm happy to take any questions at this point, or if there are any at the end. So in terms of that termination trigger, I mentioned kind of the underlying volatility in reoffending. So we tested a number of scenarios. So what would happen if a provider decides to aim for that deduction threshold? If that's their strategy, they don't try and reduce reoffending as we want them to, but they actually just try and camp out there, take a little bit of money out of their provision, but not allow reoffending to increase too much. And kind of the answer is it doesn't look like a very good strategy for providers. So the red line on this chart is the kind of the cumulative probability that a provider will breach that termination trigger if they employ that strategy of aiming for the deduction threshold. And you can see it's a pretty risky strategy for a provider to undertake. We ended up with 7-year contracts, and over a 7-year contract, you're looking at nearly 90% probability of exceeding that termination trigger over the period. In contrast, if you were to aim for, the yellow line suggests if you aim for a 0, you just aim for the baseline, your cumulative probability of termination is much lower, 20%. That's still not really where we want providers to be. At the very least, we want them to kind of be aiming for this payment threshold around the -1 percentage point. But obviously, we think they can get to -3 percentage point based on the evidence. And the probability of kind of, just because of the underlying volatility in reoffending rates, if you aim for that kind of payment point, the probability of you being terminated for factors outside of your control or breaching that termination trigger is really small, about 1% or less than 1%. So that's kind of some of the work we did to really look at how the incentives would work on the binary payment mechanism. So moving on to the frequency mechanism. It's a lot more simple. It's just a straight line. Again, it's kind of increased payments for increased reductions in reoffending. The reason we've got a different design for this one is mainly because this is a more volatile measure of reoffending. So we did the same type of analysis of kind of looking at how wide the different confidence intervals would be and how close they'd be to our kind of reasonable reduction in reoffending. And in doing so, we kind of found, so this 0.25 reduction in reoffences per reoffender, we found that in the most volatile areas, any confidence interval, any sensible confidence interval you looked at was actually getting quite close to that, which meant that in order to secure kind of a decent payment for your underlying performance, you'd have to go kind of a lot further beyond what we thought was a reasonable reduction based on the evidence. So in this case, we just went for something super simple, which still drives the right incentives. Clearly, you're getting deducted if you increase reoffending and rewarded if you decrease it, but something slightly different. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how performance varies across the two different mechanisms, whether the payment mechanisms have any impact on that. So that's kind of really, I guess, the core of the payment mechanisms. There's tons of other stuff we did around looking at how you do payments at the end of contracts, how you adjust payments if volumes are slightly different compared to what we expected, because over a 7-year contract they're inevitably going to be different. But really, this is kind of the core kind of incentives, if you like, in the paper. Yes, and then so I mentioned the £4,000 per offender on their binary metric. On the frequency metric, similar formula for working out how much a provider gets paid in any given period. Effectively, you get £1,000 per offence you stop. So the first three components of that formula help you work out how many offences a provider's prevented, and then £1,000 per offence. And the reason kind of we've gone for 4,000 on the binary and 1,000 on the frequency, it goes back to kind of that evidence. We looked at reoffending rates at the start. So on average, each reoffender commits 4 offences. So this ratio means there's kind of the same incentive to prevent offences on both the frequency and the binary metrics. There's no incentive for a provider to kind of go and put all of their eggs in one basket and kind of neglect the other one. So it kind of complements some of the stuff I was talking about earlier around avoiding kind of parking particular offenders. And again, it's capped at 50% of the total available payment budget. So where are we now? So I said there was competition in 2014. The results of that competition were announced towards the end of 2014, and then the CRCs, the new owners of the CRCs, took control in February of last year. There was a short lag before kind of the offenders started being measured for PVR purposes, just to allow kind of the new providers to bed in. So they began forming in October 2015. But we won't know the results of this for a couple of years. The reason being, it just takes quite a long time to measure reoffending. So if somebody's sentenced to an 8-month sentence, you have to serve 4 of it. We then measure reoffending a year. So from release from prison, we look at what the reoffending rate is within a year, so we have to wait a year for that. We have to wait 6 months to see stuff go through the courts, and then we have to wait about 5 months for the data to kind of filter up through the courts, and for us to kind of analyse it and double check it and work out how much we owe or are owed by the CRCs. So I think it'll be really interesting to kind of see where we are in just under 2 years' time, and we'll get the results from this. And then from there on, we'll get results fairly regularly for the next 7 years, as kind of the contracts run their course. So that's it really. That's all my very brief kind of overview of quite a lot of work. But happy to take any questions anyone's got on any of it.
How predictable are reoffending rates?
Yes, sir. Yeah, just wondering how predictable reoffending rates are at either aggregate or individual level.
Easier at aggregate, of course. So they've been fairly stable for quite a long time. And what's not shown in that graph is it doesn't adjust for kind of offender characteristics, which can change over time, which obviously have an influence on them. So when you actually control for those, I think they're even more stable. So it's a difficult question, but I think that was really the rationale for doing anything. The fact that they were stable and absent any further reform, were likely to stay stable for a fairly long time. At the individual level, there's all sorts of tools that people use to actually work out what kind of requirements people should get, what kind of sentences they should get. that kind of look at the risk of reoffending kind of based on characteristics such as offending history, age, gender, those types of things. So I think, and there's a lot of work that the ministry does looking at things like criminal careers. So there tends to be fairly regular pathways that people go into offending and follow. And, it seems to be the best things to stop people reoffending and to grow up and kind of settle down with a partner. But very difficult to do with offender management.
Just wondered,
is it possible to compare with the non-contracted provision still?
It's difficult just because of the nature of the differences in the offences and offenders committed. So because the national stuff is going to be is high risk, they're going to have a different reoffending profile naturally to the CRCs. I mean, there would have been a case potentially to just compete out some of the CRCs and just, which would provide you with a really nice comparison group over time. You could you'd have that a really clear counterfactual at the time to be able to have a look at differences between the private providers and the public.
Is the whole of the UK? Or?
England and Wales, Ministry of Justice.
So you've got Scotland as a control?
Scottish justice system is slightly different to ours, so they have a different court system, so they don't have a magistrates court in the same way that we do. They have different sentencing powers, different offender management, so it's not a clean enough comparison.
Did you look at any alternative delivery models? I'm wondering if you looked at something like, say, a voluntary agreement among offender managers, and did you try and work out what the transaction costs are of this model relative to an alternative model? I'm just saying that, in monitoring, etc., might be quite costly. Wondering, alternative models, say something like voluntary agreement, such that, might achieve the same results at lower cost of living. Did you look into that?
The questions about whether we looked at alternative delivery models. So in terms of voluntary agreements, you mean voluntary agreements kind of with offenders?
No, with the probation agent, probation, private sector, with the management of offenders.
Well, I mean, we looked at alternative payment mechanisms. Certainly, I think there was a real clear kind of desire to offer quite a hard-edged incentive, if you like, which kind of I feel would get a bit more blurred in more of a voluntary arrangement. I think what's interesting about this model is actually it gives the providers a lot of freedom about what they do in terms of delivering probation. So we haven't mandated exactly what they do in terms of delivering the sentence. We're mainly just interested in the outcome, and then we want to kind of learn from exactly what they did after the fact, if you like. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I have a question about the payment mechanism for the binary payment.
Sure.
Could you go back to that, please? You explained how you'd address the risk of getting caught at the deduction threshold point with your ISO profit curves, but it looks like there's another point where you could get caught, which is at the payment threshold. If you were to extend out those ISO profit lines, you'd get to there. Could you explain to me how you decided that it was more important to have the non-payment threshold in the middle? How the benefit of doing that outweighed the risk of getting caught at the other pinch point that I described?
Yeah, sure. So I think, kind of in saying that, you're right. There's kind of as an economist, you probably abhor kinks in this kind of in this kind of mechanism. I think the rationale there. So we did quite a bit of kind of Monte Carlo analysis, trying to look at what providers' incentives would be with different cost functions, where they would kind of maximise profit. So we looked at that one as well as kind of as kind of part of that. The analysis suggests it wasn't such a concern. So it was kind of dominated, if you like, by something further up the line towards the top right. The reason being, effectively, if you aim for that point, half the time you're not going to get paid at all, because even if your underlying reduction in reoffending is bang on that point, the natural volatility means that half the time you're going to fall back to the zero in terms of payment. Half the time you're going to be slightly above it, but that cliff edge is kind of much more stark than the gradual increase to the top right.
I was wondering how much do you know about the cost structure of the